I'm always of the mind, given the diverse audience that we normally have in what we do, hoping that folks will grab at least one nugget of useful information that they can apply in their operations. And so my hope is that today is no different. We have a mixed bag, and I will say quite candidly, what we should have done is put out our little questionnaire a little bit ahead of time just to get a sense of the audience. But it is interesting that we do have a mixed bag of private medical practices on board today and hospital employed groups. And as we go through the presentation today, what you'll find, I think, is that some of this is going to be, for lack of a better phrase, old hat, things you know to be true and that should be happening and maybe are or aren't happening. And then some of the things I hope that you'll look at and say, holy cow, we should be doing that better. Again, this is a diverse audience with private medical practices and hospital employed models. More than likely, I would guess that the hospital folks are probably the rev cycle folks. And so one of the things that I think is important to take away from this, generally speaking, is that the revenue cycle process is a scalable model. So once you have the process in place, whether you're a 2-physician practice or a 500-physician multi-specialty employed model, once the process is established, it's scalable. So it really involves, and we'll get into this a little bit further during the afternoon, but it involves putting the right pieces in the right players, getting the right reporting set up, and managing and monitoring appropriate pieces in the rev cycle. So without further ado, we'll move onward, and we will, at the end of the webinar, have some time left over for some questions. And as is always the case for me, if you ever just want to give me a call at some point, sometime, and just ask a question or shoot the breeze about anything that's bothering you, feel free. Always happy to offer my 2 cents for what they're worth, and happy to provide an outside opinion. So at any time, please do feel free to reach out. What I'd like to get accomplished today, kind of broadly, is an understanding of the warning signs of dysfunction in the rev cycle. The fact that you need to empower the employees to participate and manage the process. Every employee plays a role, and we'll drill down into that a little bit further. I'm going to review a broken rev cycle structure that is essentially a little brief case study at the end to show how things can go south pretty fast if not only one piece is broken, but if several pieces are broken. But that also is never fatal until it becomes fatal. I mean, there's a point where things just get chaotically out of hand, obviously, and it's hard to retrieve. But assembling a good team and putting good processes in place will ensure that when the bumps arise, you'll be able to work around those bumps and conquer them, if you will. So we sent out our little questionnaire again. We will learn from this and try to get this out a little bit ahead of time. But as I mentioned, there are some private practices on board and some employed models. And what we talk about today really applies to both. It's just in some instances you'll have different masters, whether it's the physician shareholders in the private practice or whether it is the hospital CFO, or maybe, depending on how you're structured, a VP or EVP of the physician practice management employed model. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the process, the warning signs and dangers, some other things that may be out there, the rev cycle process. And then, like I said, we'll spend some time on a case study at the end, and I will talk through some of the things that we have experienced in a fairly good-sized employed model. And then we'll do just a brief summary to pull it all together, and obviously leave some time for Q&A. So the process. The revenue cycle process, the slide before you is fairly generic. Obviously, check in, the patient visit, check out, follow up. But as you all know, every step of that process has a multitude of different little baby components that roll up into it. So check-in is not purely patient shows up at the window, I greet them, ask them if they have the same insurance. It's much more detailed than that, and it has to be to ensure that the process is started appropriately, especially in this day and age of the higher deductible plans. And in fact, a lot of the eligibility work should happen prior to the actual face-to-face check-in process. One thing I wanted to add, which I forgot to mention at the outset, is that the one thing that I think what I'm going to paint for you is a picture of probably how things should be, and I think how they could be depending on how the work is divvied up and all that. But I know that whether you're in a private practice or you're in the hospital setting, there may be, let's call it, an underinvestment from time to time in the revenue cycle, or your perception of the underinvestment revenue cycle. And sometimes the things that have to take place get backburnered, and that's why things happen. That's why problems arise, is because we underinvest or don't pay real good attention to every component that goes into this. So I understand that. I feel your pain, and I think sometimes you just have to make do with what you have available unless you can lobby objectively for some more resources. So the next slide details components that go into the prior slide, slide 6. So really, you've got patient eligibility verification, claims submission, the payer remit, the lockbox remit, denial management, patient collections, and patient remit posting. And even in those pieces, there are further sub-bullets that could be drilled down into in each one of those. And for sake of time in today's discussion, I wouldn't deign to get down into all of those various components. But I think the underlying message is that this revenue cycle process is not simply charging, collecting, posting, and follow up on those things. It's much more detailed, involves many more steps. What I've got on slide 8 is just a little bit more detail about those things that go into the process. And again, I would suggest to you this is not even the full listing. So you've obviously got the professional quals, which are credentialing, provider enrollment, re-credentialing, managed care contracting, the services such as scheduling, referral management in and out, pre-reg and reg forms. So as you can see from this, there are a ton of moving parts. And as we get further in the discussion, I'll speak to a little bit more of how to manage these component pieces, because there needs to be, with staff, accountability. And as a recovering administrator, I know you have limited resources. I've walked that walk before. But I think one of the things we struggle with in management is we oftentimes tend to get to year's end. We're all in a hurry. We're all trying to tie up the end of the year, get the financial pieces tied up. And oh, by the way, we have to do evaluations on all of our people. And what happens oftentimes is that employees are evaluated essentially either because they're our buddies or they did a great job in the last 2 weeks of the year, and we therefore give them a glowing review. When in reality, we may be struggling on things like the rev cycle or patient interaction and things of that nature. And so I've always been a real big advocate of understanding what the job is that the people are doing for me, especially in the rev cycle piece or even in the clinical piece for that matter, but understanding what they're doing, making sure that they understand what's going on, and that we monitor and measure all of those things that transpire so that at the end of the year, as part of their narrative and their evals, we also have an objective component where we can measure how things went. And certainly it's a lot better review when you get some actual measurement criteria. And I'm sure we all feel better if objectively someone could say, hey, you got a 98 out of 100, nice job, instead of, hey, I'm glad you showed up for work all year. So in any event, digressing a little bit, these are all component pieces to that ecosystem of the rev cycle. And, you know, again, the misnomer in revenue cycle management has been forever that it's charging, capturing, posting, thank you very much. And I would suggest to you that almost everyone in the practice, if not everyone, plays a role in the rev cycle process. So when we look at the processes, I look at this as a top-down approach. Obviously, there's a difference between managing and leading, and I think it's incumbent on the manager. And I know for folks who have smaller practices, maybe who are strapped for resources, this is a big ask. I know it's really difficult to carve out time, but I think it's essential to carve out time to review where you are in the process, because investing that time on the front end will save you pain and wear and tear on the back end. So from a leadership standpoint, I think the revenue cycle management process starts with the leader, whether it's the administrator in a small group or whether it's a rev cycle director or a hospital employed model or whoever in between, to delineate the process from cradle to grave. The intake, all the steps with regard to the eligibility, basically the pieces delineated here, and any other that you could add to that process. And so delineating cradle to grave of the transaction and how it transpires, diagramming, if you're so inclined, the internal and external functions, and you don't have to do that necessarily, but certainly the process warrants understanding what those internal and external functions are. And then really kind of putting the pen to paper and noodling who will be the responsible party for what piece, so that you start to craft that ability to delegate, and it really helps you assess those people who you think are capable of performing. And I will tell you, the people who are higher performers, they want more to do. Well, relatively speaking, especially if that comes with a little reward, but they want to be busy. They want to know that you believe in them. And so, you know, picking your top performers and trying to groom them for the next level is a really important process as well. Monitoring performance and employee statistics, gathering information. I would suggest, however this looks, given your model, again, this is a scalable thing. So if you're in a 5 or 10 doc practice, this might just be you and the rev cycle manager if you're the administrator. It might be you and the lead physician, whatever the case is. But getting together a sort of committee that can either be ad hoc or standing that gathers information, because I will tell you as an administrator, again, I never profess to know everything my people do all the time, and I think if you do, then you've got a better handle on things than I do, but I think that instance is essentially few and far between. So going to our people and not presupposing that we know everything about everything, and asking them to provide us input on, you know, we've gathered the information as the leadership, and we've said, here's what I think. What do you guys think? Where are we on this? Are we doing this well? Are we doing that well? What am I missing? And make it really a team. Empower your folks to make it a team effort to better the process. And I think they'd want to know, you know, here's what the end result is going to be, and we're going to hold you accountable. Let's work together to make this better. We'll speak a little later to this, but if you're in a private practice, your physicians probably would love having this take place, because as you know, every dollar that doesn't get spent drops to the shareholders and normally drops straight through to compensation. So if we're able to bill more appropriately, bring those revenues in that are due us, docs are going to be real happy. And if you're on the hospital side, obviously the CFO is going to be happier. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. So listen to employees who actually perform the jobs. You'll have to weed through some of the excuses maybe and the gnashing of teeth when you walk through this, but you'll know the employees, and you can probably picture some of those in your head right now, who will latch onto this and will want to do this, especially if you're willing to help them make their jobs better. No benchmarks, establish baselines and report. There are obviously benchmarks out there that are readily acceptable, kind of national standards, and I know everyone will say, well, they don't apply to me because we're different. And I know everyone's different a little bit, but they do give you a certain standard with which you can hold your people accountable. And so the benchmarks, even if you create internal benchmarks, they give you measurement criteria, again, that can be used to report to the shareholders, or can be used or be used to help offer staff really much better measurable outcomes for the jobs that they do. Create staff incentives. You may want to look to building a pool of cash if that's available, even if it's little, but something that staff can aspire to and know that there's a little bit of gold at the end of the rainbow. Doesn't have to be, this boatload of cash, but maybe help them, I guess for lack of a better term, gain share in the victory that you're doing. Again, this will empower folks. You'll be able to report benchmarks back to them. They'll be able to gauge progress. I think part of this process also entails education of patients. Many come in, they've changed Medicare, they're Medicare managed, or whatever the case may be. They do have a copay, they don't. They have a secondary, or they don't. Really helping them understand, especially as we move forward with some of these higher deductible plans, is helping them to understand what their responsibilities are. And that's the sticky wicket, especially at the front desk, because it's hard to ask people for money. But when you go, and I don't want to minimize the value of healthcare, obviously, but I'll make this analogy. When you go to the grocery store, you're not negotiating for a box of cereal. They say this cereal costs $1, well, it doesn't. This cereal costs $4.50, and you can pay us, or you can just leave the cereal. We don't do that in healthcare, and I understand it's a little bit different, but the reality is there's value to the service that we provide to patients. Understanding the reasons for the denial. This is getting a little more in the weeds than I meant to do here, so I'll apologize. But really understanding, and it's part of the information gathering process, why claims are kicking out. Not just writing off claims when they kick, but understanding denials, understanding by payer, because some payers deny certain things religiously, and you have to decide if you're going to be aggressive in going after those monies, depending on what the what your relationship is with the payers and how big a role they play in your revenue stream. I think it's probably safe to say that in many states, DCBS plays a pretty big role in your revenue, and depending on your specialty, probably Medicare, and nowadays with ACA and in some states expanded Medicaid, probably Medicare and Medicaid play a significant role as well. But knowing what your allowables are, even if it's just for those three payers, will enable you to understand how much revenue you're due. So then we get into process management. So you've got your leadership, you're designing the plan, you're bringing your resources together, you're engaging your staff to help make it better, and you're empowering them to do the job. And honestly, too, it will enable you to, and I'll put it in these kind of stark terms, again, not a pleasant thing, but you can deselect certain people who aren't getting the job done. Practice management, like any business, is not a charity. And the goal there is to have the best people and empower them to do the jobs. So one of the biggest things, and I know we all struggle with this, is credentialing and privileging. The case study I'm going to speak to later, a big component of the rec was credentialing. And I know that what happens on the private side and in the employed model side is you basically will get an email that Dr. X is going to start Monday, and let's get him fully ramped up and scheduled. Well, unless you got Medicare or somewhere where you can go back, you're going to be giving a lot of charity care away if you just, start billing for this physician. So there needs to be continuity between the credentialing folks and whether it's medical staff or whomever on the hospital side, or whether it's Dr. X who just signed a contract with Dr. Y on the private practice side. Understanding your fee schedules, again, this is generic and it speaks to both hospital side and private practice side. So understanding the fee schedule relative to the allowables. We all know that charges have very little to do with the actual revenue, relatively speaking, and I'll talk to that a little bit later. I know some make the argument that our charges are up and we're doing better financially. Yeah, I get that, but we'll talk about that a little later. What you need to really understand is what dollars are due to the practice, and that's key in this process. Locate contracts, understand the terms. Again, I think this goes to both private practice and hospital situations where there's a little bit of a disconnect with contracts. I know that in a lot of private practices, not all of them, the contracts are in someone's desk somewhere, and they're probably evergreen and possibly have some onerous language where, hey, we reserve the right to decrease your reimbursement 10% a year just because, or something like that. Contracts that are tied into Medicare rates, if Medicare goes down in the reimbursements, you automatically take a pay cut. So if you're doing 100 level 3 office visits and you're doing 100, you'll do 100 this year, but Medicare is cutting level 3s, you will get a de facto reimbursement cut from whoever your private pay is if they're tied into Medicare. So that's some language to be aware of. Are you involved with, or do you understand the contracting process? Again, I think that directors of rev cycle, directors in the rev cycle should be, even if you're not negotiating, even if it's your CFO negotiating contracts, you should at least understand what's going on, have some input, know what the volumes are that are in the practices so that you can negotiate. And if you're using an IPA, understand very acutely IPAs can't negotiate for you. They can deliver or messenger what the rates are. So you need to understand how that process works. And if you're in a private practice, even if your physician is negotiating, you should sit at the table and understand, because the administrators, or if you're in a larger private practice, the rev cycle managers are the ones who are tending to all the data that's out there. You have access to how many level 3 rechecks or level 3 office visits, or if you're still private in your cardiology, how many nuke studies or echoes or whatever is going on. You know, or should know by payer, how many studies you're doing, and that helps you to lever your negotiations. We have been notoriously bad in the private practice setting of using our data. You know, we are the holders of all the quality data and all the billing data, and we've been really bad at levering that to our benefit. And I know part of it is because we're so doggone busy, and I get that, but it's really a missed opportunity. Educate staff, again, with benchmarks. You'll develop your benchmarks in your leadership process and your aggregation of data, your measurements, and then show them what those goals are. We had a project recently where really lackluster upfront collections. You know, we put in place, here's what the goal is, let's go get this. And we made it an aggressive goal. We really stretched. And staff was kind of into, you know, holy cow, did we meet it? Did we not meet it? How far are we from doing it? You know, all that stuff. And they ended up doing 7 figures in increased front office cash in the door collections. So, you know, anything over $1 million extra money you didn't have, that's kind of nice. Educate providers and manage expectations. Again, a little bit of a difference in terms of the physician side on the private practice versus the hospital model. Nonetheless, they play a role in this. Are they finishing their charts timely? I hope so. If they're on a rev, or if they're on a work review comp model, for their sake, I hope they're getting their charts turned in timely. But you know, again, this is one thing we struggle with kind of historically in the healthcare space is docs either not finishing up their charting and getting things turned in, or it takes 2 weeks or 4 or 6 weeks or whatever the case may be. And I know I'm not a physician, and I'm sure it's painful, but it is part of the process. And for you as a private practice, or even on the hospital side, getting these guys and gals to get their charts done and turned in timely really impacts cash flow. Develop a component of staff eval that includes objective measurements of revenue cycle success. Spoke to that. We'll speak more to that a little bit later. So when you break that down, we get into the process front desk. You've designed your plan. Now you're going to lead as the manager, or whatever your role is, or you will empower a leader to go out and manage all these pieces that were in that sort of life cycle that we brought up before. Because theoretically, you've now built this structure that, again, is scalable with all these components. And so it involves maybe the key person at the front desk. Hey, you know, Susie, here's what we're going to do. It's pre-visit, it's verify eligibility. You can use some of the pre-verification tools that are out there, understanding what to do at the time of visit, deploying kiosks and e-tools to ensure eligibility and accuracy. One of the things that I rage about, you have to forgive me, but it's, and you all know this happens, is that one person at the front desk or everyone at the front desk who says, oh, do you still have insurance X? And the patient says, oh, yeah, sure I do. And if they don't, I mean, honestly, all you're doing is adding pain to the process, because you're going to get denial out of the gate, and then you're going to have to pay more money on the back end to chase that person around. And it's just, it's a painful process, and why not do it right the first time? Front desk, again, collecting what you can, 100% where possible of collections that are due at the time of service. And as I mentioned, build that into staff evals. Create tools and vignettes to help manage difficult tasks of over-the-counter collections. It's hard asking people for money. I get that, but part of their contract with the payers is that they owe a certain piece for their care. And so they're obligated to do this. You're asking to pay their obligation. And I know it's hard, and maybe doing it at the front desk is not the right way to go. And so one of the things you want to do is maybe designate a financial counselor, especially if you're doing surgical procedures. You can start getting to higher dollar, whether it's elective or whether it's surge or even scans and expensive CAT scans or MRIs. Sitting down or carving out some side time for someone to sit down and talk through the process of what it entails with the patient. Obviously, reconciling patient payments with encounters at the end of the day, make sure that all of that balances, using credit cards or financing for high dollar elective procedures. There are financing companies out there that will take this and chase it and ask for a piece of the money. So there are ways to mitigate some of the effort on staff. And honestly, so swinging back around to the leadership piece, as you build this plan and process and aggregate your data, first of all, I would plan on a timeline, because as busy as all of us are, if you don't build a timeline and expectation into it, you won't get to it, because it's forever going to hit back burner. But when you do this, I think you build into this, here's the process, here's the plan. We're going to start this on 1/1. We're going to unveil it on April 30th, and we're going to move forward from there, having meetings monthly, whatever the case may be. But included in that should be a really careful analysis of the cost to deliver. So how much does it cost me to bill and collect and post and chase and all that stuff? And is there a solution out there that will deliver me a better return on investment where I don't have to manage that? And oh, by the way, it costs 10 cents for every dollar they're going to bring in the door. Maybe that's the right investment for me. So that ROI piece and development of that plan really goes a long way for the clinic. So payment plans, financial counselor, an aggressive plan in place, going too fast, an aggressive plan for the non-covered services, an ABM style approach, where what isn't going to be covered, the patient understands very fully and is willing to pay. If it's a large dollar amount, maybe they pay a piece up front and you work out a payment plan with them if possible. The process also should include patient balance collections, overdue accounts, your collection agency, how aggressive are they? There are some that are very good out there, and there are some who, frankly, struggle, and I'm sure we all have some war stories related to utilizing collection agencies. And part of this is politics, too. Physicians who run private practices don't want to irritate their patients and collect money sometimes. Some do, and again, I think it's legitimate to, but you need to have a policy in place that when you turn the money over, going after a collection agency, make sure they pay you and collect the money. In-house collections, the collection letters, calls, in that collection letter process, how many letters before you turn it over? At what day in the aging bucket do you finally turn things over to collections, or respectfully divorce the patient from the practice? The care can't be free. Now, I know physicians want to give some care out for free, and that's totally fine. That becomes an internal decision either with the health system or with the private practice shareholders. This process piece really goes to the leadership piece, and when you're building the structure initially, these are, again, subcomponents that go into the overall revenue cycle process that you're going to design. And what I didn't talk about on the back end, of course, is denial reasons. The one thing that drives me insane, which I have seen, and I know it happens, and it's a struggle because it requires a lot of oversight. But you will get, from time to time, clinics or systems that profess to have 25 days in AR. And I always look at that, and my first response is always, that is awesome, because that indicates that it's a well-managed process, things are going really well. The piece of me that looks at that a little bit curiously, maybe even cynically, is, it requires a lot of management to get to 25 days. And so are these artificially adjusted reimbursements that should have been collected? They were allowable money, but staff is either motivated to hit the AR days, or they just want to get the AR days and be left alone, that they will write off money through the practice instead of letting it age. And so on the one hand, 25 days, pretty good. On the other hand, are we hitting it because we're doing the right things? So, proper documentation and coding. So it's insurance verified, it's copay collection. Proper documentation and coding, of course, which entails the physician. Claim scrub and submission. Did we get the full payment? Have we bounced that off our allowable fee schedule? If we're getting denials, let's measure that by payer. Is Blue Cross Blue Shield denying every level 1 office visit or level 5 office visit with a code 12345? If so, why is that? And let's look at that. If it's not legitimate, let's appeal it, and let's sit down with Blue Cross Blue Shield and say, hey, why are you guys doing this to us? These are all documented appropriately. Dr. X documents level 5. They should be billed unless there's otherwise an issue with it that you need to point out to us. And remember, too, in the process, the insurance commissioner should be your friend. If you're in denial that shouldn't happen, you certainly can go to the insurance commissioner of your state, and if you're willing to do it, raise that issue. And I will tell you, having worked in Medicare fraud and abuse and Medicare appeals and reconsiderations, if you think you have a legitimate beef with Medicare and the monies outstanding are worth going after, that is a process worth doing. Medicare will reverse appeals. If you go to the administrative law judge, you can get things reversed. It happens, but you have to be obviously in the right. But if you feel like you're in the right and everything's documented in there, then it's legitimate to go after that stuff. Once the process is in place, remember that it's a dynamic system. It's not static. You don't just push play and it keeps going. So it's engage key staff, thought leaders, and impacted parties, which include everybody and the physician. If you're in a big practice, maybe it's not all of the physicians. Maybe it's a key thought leader who reports back to their partners. But you meet regularly, whatever that is, monthly or quarterly. You refine the process. You figure out what does and doesn't work. You educate staff. Communication is key in this. You take into account all the processes from start to finish. Monitor and manage. As I said, maintain a standing group, and you've got to involve the docs at some level. So again, here's sort of broadly the generic look at what we've been talking about. And it involves really breaking down all of these pieces into their sub-bullets and assigning either those sub-bullets or the sub-bullets to other parties, but making sure people understand what they're accountable for. In the private practice, physicians have a major impact on virtually everything in the rev cycle process. If they want to write stuff off, I would have a for it. I mean, you can't have Dr. 1, liking every patient or wanting to be that guy and just say, Mrs. Smith, don't worry about it. We're going to write it off. We'll just take what your insurance company paid, X, Y, and Z. You get into some different issues with that as well. There has to be a policy for write-offs, for professional courtesy, if you still offer those types of things. That all comes into play. Physicians from the beginning, the private practice side, you need to tell them what you think you need to do to get things done so that you can get their buy-in, get their ideas and perceptions and address those. I think you should respectfully, as a professional on the management side, offer them feedback and pushback from time to time. Educate them on how their roles impact the revenue cycle process and that their behavior is crucial in the process. Finish your charts timely. Reduce lag days. Lag days defined as how long it takes you to get your charts done. That impacts the revenue cycle and cash flow. And honestly, docs are numbers folks. If you can make an argument to them that, hey, you're charging $30,000 a week on average, and we collect $25,000 a week, you delaying a week is $25,000 we don't get in the door. So, make that quantifiable argument with your physicians and your NPs and PAs that's money left on the table. If you're in an employed model, depending on how the model is situated, physicians may be a little bit less concerned because in many of these models, the docs are paid on work RVUs. I know that and have designed some comp models where physicians are also paid in part on operational efficiency. And what can be entailed in that is, hey, you've got certain criteria you need to meet to help make the practice operate efficiently. That might include finishing your charts within 7 days. It might include helping us manage overhead, things of that nature. But if your physicians have swayed from private to hospital-employed models and are just getting RVUs, they may be hands in the air totally unplugged from the process. And I think it's worthwhile to at least let them know how the process is impacted by their actions. The appropriateness of documentation coding and education about documentation and coding and errors is important to show the physicians. Again, you might not look at this as rev cycle, but I do, and that is, if your docs are billing all level 2 rechecks or new patients, and they can legitimately bill some 4s in there, that's money left on the table. That is, in my opinion, a little bit of the revenue cycle process. And understand, I don't suggest overbilling ever. Again, I have worked fraud and abuse, I get it, but what I am suggesting is don't undercode because you're scared you're going to get audited. Code appropriately for the services that you provide. Ensure lag times reduced. Provide physicians with the KPIs, the key performance indicators. Develop those, and I'll go over some of those a little bit later, but develop some of those and show them what they are, and update them on those. Doctors like, in my 27 years in this business, doctors like to see numbers, legitimate, good, real numbers, not something you pulled out of the air, but good numbers that measure what they're doing. And again, this may not be your priority in the employed model, but they need to understand the role they play. And so measuring and reporting, giving meaningful real targets. Don't set a budget up that's 100% of last year. To me, that seems nonsensical. But give people a stretch and ask them, do you think we can hit this? Here's what our clinic looks like right now. Do you think we can hit this? And I'm sorry, I'm going to move on just a touch fast. Selection of billing timetable, organizing your delinquent accounts. I mean, these are some steps in the output of your developing your process. Is, delinquent accounts by, maybe you'll split them out by payer so that they're easier to track, or by patient pay versus payer, or whatever the case may be, but delineate those things. Maybe have a customer service person who, depending on your practice structure and how many FTEs you have available, someone who could be a go-to to answer questions. I'm sure everyone at this point has a welcome package, but that obviously has to include the patient's responsibility. And I would bet, honestly, 99% of you out there right now have those delineated just because of where we are in finances and healthcare today. Certainly conduct the coding and billing audit to make sure that physicians are educated. And it's not to be suspicious, it's just to see, hey, are we leaving dollars on the table? Output should be analyzing your error monthly, the aging bucket, self-pay revenues, which are becoming a bigger and bigger factor nowadays for all practices, whether you're private practice or in the hospital employed model. Exception reports, what's getting denied and why. Tracking the payment levels, gross and net. I do track, or I would track gross, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. Evaluating payer allowables versus reimbursement, which we talked about. Ensuring secondaries pay, and that the crosswalk to secondaries happens smoothly and that you're getting reimbursed as you're supposed to. Monthly reporting to all of your constituents, whether they're staff members or physicians. Conquering coding and coding accuracy, and I mentioned billing and coding audit. So the responsibility, kind of like this slide, so I'd throw it out there. No individual raindrop considers itself responsible for the flood. And that's it. It's like any process. The front desk person may not consider themselves to be that raindrop, but together, obviously, you got the next raindrop down the line, which is the physician who doesn't code appropriately, and ultimately you end up having a flood of bad outcomes, mismanaged processes, or no processes. This is decidedly a team endeavor, which I probably have made painfully clear in the last 40 minutes. Requires great leadership and great people. It requires a leader putting the plan together and then not holding on too tight. We all have so much to do. I'm sure most of you can't babysit this on a daily basis unless your job is to babysit this. But even if it is, even if you're the director of a revenue cycle, getting good people to get you what you need and to deliver on the job. And for some of you, it's probably going to require entrusting and letting go of certain things. And I know that can be a very difficult challenge, but that's what separates really good leaders and good managers from those who are really overly in the weeds on a day-to-day basis or are overwhelmed. As I mentioned before, this whole process requires great communication And all these pieces I'll speak to a little bit later on the case study, and you'll see, and you may have experienced some of them, where they negatively impact what we do. Cross-training. I used to have a phrase in the business when I was in the trenches, which is, you know, what happens if Susie gets hit by the beer truck? And that's the thing. What are you going to do if someone gets a great job offer across the street for $1 more an hour and they give you 2 weeks notice? What happens in that instance? What's our backup plan? Nothing happens in a vacuum. Something breaks on the front end. You know, it's that tired adage of throw a pebble in the water and watch it ripple. Someone breaks something on the front end, it's going to force throughout the entire ecosystem that we've talked about through this whole process. Now, forgive me, I have a glitch in my slides, so this one's going to pop up in front of you a couple times. These numbers need to be updated, but the idea behind these holds true. This study came out a while ago, but it just shows, and I could go and hunt down for you new data on this, and it may be even worse given the number of high deductible plans out there now. But this is sort of what you can expect. You let the money sit out there, and you're getting, if it sits out there for a year, you're getting somewhere on the order of 26 cents on the dollar. And I would suggest to you, it's not even that good anymore. So, sorry, there's my, okay, that's it. So the warning signs. Really what needs to happen, and there are more warning signs than this, but these are a few keys to watch, and I'll talk a little bit more about this on a couple of slides further down the road. Shrinking cash flow. Are we charging more and collecting less? Now, understanding that charges aren't necessarily indicative of collections, but if you're charging $100 and you're always collecting $50, and then you go up to charging 125, and now you're reduced to 45, you know, something stinks in Denmark and requires a little further analysis. Reduced collections percentage, $100, and we've increased to 125. And when I say that, for the hospital folks, I'm talking about your adjusted stuff. You've applied your contractual adjustment, and it's 100 to 125. And for you in private practice, I'm saying that's your $100 that should come in the door on the top line, and now you're up to what you should have is 125. And then we only collect 98. Well, we collected 98, which on the front end is great. 98% collection rate, huge. But now we're collecting only 92, and we're down to 74%. Why is that? What's going on in the process? And honestly, you should be managing this as the manager, but someone should be coming to you ahead of time, whoever's managing this micro component, saying, you know, hey, coach, we got an issue. We're down to 74%, and here's what I think is going on. Growing accounts receivable. You know, if our total AR was 125 and we are now at 190, why is that? Did we hire 10 doctors and they are going gangbusters, or is there something a little more unseemly under the surface? Older aging bucket. You know, our 0 to 30, we went from 80 to 50, and you can see that our greater than 120 has grown. And in fact, our 90 to greater than 120 is now 35%. Why is that? What's going on there that shouldn't be happening? Increasing days in AR are artificially low. Again, let's just say hypothetically in this model, these folks are doing 32 days, and we all love that. It's well managed and monitored, and everyone's happy. But all of a sudden, we went to 65. What happened to push that to 65? We need to drill down and figure that out. So gross collection rate, I'm not a huge fan of that, I will tell you. The hospital folks, I know you deal with the charges as being your accrued revenue, and I understand how that works. We've done a lot of work on the hospital side in revenue cycle. But I will tell you this, when you monitor different, and I'm kind of a data wonk guy, when you monitor different data elements, what you come to find is gross charges, not the gross collection rate per se, but the gross charges can be a piece indicative of how busy folks are. When you tie those into work RVUs, collected money, collectible money, you should start to see a trend where there's some congruency in those lines. So, you know, for me, again, some of you may love gross charges. I don't necessarily, but I put this in there just as a measurement tool. What does 10% tell me on my gross collection rate? I don't know, honestly, because you all know if I charge $1 billion and collect 100,000, is that good or bad? I don't know. I could charge Medicare $1 billion for a level 3 office visit, and they're not going to pay me that. So charges in some regards don't bring all the value, but net collection rate, in my opinion, does. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to buzz to some of the numbers really quick on this. We've charged $1 million in the practice. our contractual write-offs in the practice, and we'll say this is a private practice, so we know we've adjusted off 450 grand. Our adjusted charges, we should collect 550. That's collectible cash money. For you folks on the hospital side, you know, the charges billed is your revenue, and the adjustments and write-offs is going to be your contractual adjustment. So let's say your net revenue should be 550. We collected 475 of what we expected to collect. Honestly, we should, based on these numbers, and if we're accurate in our contractual adjustments or our write-offs and everything else, we should expect to collect $550,000. Why wouldn't we? That's what's out there for us. You know, the standard rule of thumb, broadly speaking, is about 95 to 100% collection of collectible money. So this shows me we've got a problem in our collection. Days in AR, there are different ways to calculate this. I don't love this 30-day kind of thing. I'd rather you flatten out anomalies and look at this over the course of 6 months or a year. But what we're looking at here is total dollars in AR and average charges coming to 60.5 days. This is pretty good. The question is, are my charges too low? Did we have 5 docs out and my charges are all of a sudden exceedingly low? So my point being, don't look to one data point to tell you the whole story. It tells you a piece of the bigger puzzle. And what I put here is a sample snapshot and report. And I'm going to kind of hustle through this because I want to get to the case study for you. This, I would suggest to you, is a report that paints a really good picture of items that you want to measure or that you've added or deleted from this to measure. And when you're on the private practice side or even the hospital side, this may be something the CFO works with you on the hospital side. If you're on the private practice side, you may have, if you're in a small practice, you may deal with the lead physician owner, or if you're in a larger private practice, you may have a finance guy who goes and presents to the executive committee. This may be something that goes to the broader community where you hit these bullet points and you say, you know, here's what's going on. When you drill down with staff and all, you need to get down to the finer level of what my days outstanding are and what goes into that number, what the dollars outstanding are. You need to be able to drill down into all of these measurement tools to a very granular level. So you can see here, this makes it an easier, useful tool, because what you can do here is you can show via color, hey, we're off of what we want it to be, or versus either our internal benchmarks or external benchmarks, we're not hitting it. And then you go to whomever and say, here's what I think is going on, and we'll address it again next month in the report, and we hope to show you better results. But this is a snapshot, high level, that you should be able to share with your executive team or even your staff. But again, being able to drill down into each of these components, understanding why we are in the red, where we're in the red. And there may be a reasonable reason, but these should be out there to show you something's gone sideways and we need to address it. Workflow, I'm going to zip through this because you will get these slides. You can ask me a question on this. These are just sample workflow pieces, and I don't want to chew up the last 10 minutes going through every step in this process. Again, some of this is vanilla, but if you don't have something like this in place, this can just give you an idea, starting point on how the transactions in the process need to move forward. Business office functions, ditto. And understand too, one size in this or in anything I would suggest to you in practice management, one size never ever fits all. I would suggest to you there are situations where things are kind of 80-20. If I go to run a cardiology practice, 80% of what I do is going to be similar to a Euro practice or an internal med practice because it's general private practice, medical management, and small business management. Now, having said that, the other 10 to 20% is going to be cardiology specific or urology specific. And so there are nuances that need to be attended to. But a lot of the processes are also going to be about 80% vanilla, 20% malleable based on your employment situation or your staffing model. Again, scalable. This is all scalable. So you take a starting point and you build from it, you craft your thing, and then you manage it and you scale it up. If you're in a big hospital system, you might have a VP of rev cycle with AVPs throughout that manage different network pieces or what have you. But again, all scalable. You just need to build the thing and then scale it out. Other options, I'll go through these rather quickly. Identify key contact folks. This is the old adage of better to use a carrot than a stick, or a little bit of honey versus a stick in the eye, or whatever the case may be. People at Blue Cross Blue Shield are people too. They don't really want you to call them up and bless them out. Call them up, develop that rapport. You will be more likely to get better results when you find a person who you can deal with on the payer side. Understand their tactics. I will tell you, after, again, 27 years in this business, sometimes claims get denied just because. It's a little unsavory, but you need to understand why that is. Why are they doing this? Common denial reasons. Aggregate those together so you can manage them and find out why claims are getting denied for a certain reason. We talked about the customer service rep. Outsource, you may or may not want to do that. It may be distasteful to you. You have to make that decision internally. That's always a personal decision. I will tell you, as a manager, I hire for the demand. I don't overload staff because I never want to fire people. And in my 27 years of managing people, I fired 10 people. And I know who they are and I can see their faces. So I'm not an advocate of that, I will tell you. But if you can use tools instead of adding staff, use tools when you can, especially if the ROI is there. Automate process and workflow. We have a lot of tools out there with our EMRs and our PMs. How can we better use them? And bolt-on products like the kiosks and things of that nature. Don't assume the patient understands the insurance and the workflow. Claim scrubbing. Don't rely on EMRs to auto code. Don't use the, hey, you did enough to do a level 4. Examine that and make sure that that's accurate. Offer array of payment options. We talked about the ROI on different services and processes. I'm going to buzz through these. We're running short, and I am sorry. Third-party billing companies, an ASP model or a cloud model, business service provider. Again, this requires in your process understanding those things that could be automated, understanding the cost benefit of that and the ROI on that. And then the thing is, if I farm it out, do I lose control? Because you will a little bit, and am I okay with that? So always check performance, references, past successes. Don't get tied into long contracts. Make sure there's an out built in for you. Cost in-house versus out, run the numbers. So what's on the way? Volume to value, and I know that's getting thrown out there because it's fun to say and all that good stuff. But understanding and prepping for how global payments are going to impact you. I know we've got ICD-10 out there. How's that working for you? I mean, what are you seeing now relative to ICD-10? I know the doomsayers said, hey, it's going to be these huge cash crunches on people, and I know things are getting eased in, but what's going on with you right now, and how is that going to impact you? Part of this process is going to involve looking ahead at what's coming down the road. And if you're going to get a bulk payment, how are you going to be able to grab that bulk payment and apply it? And I would tell you, a lot of this is still a little bit out there in the ether. Will you be ready for upcoming changes so that your processes are malleable? Do you have the people in place? And I know, believe me, I get it. A lot of you are out there saying, oh, Jeff, I'm the only person doing this. I get it. I understand. But without building a process, at least even in basic structure, you're going to be forever putting out fires. Believe me, I know it. I'm going to skip that ICD-10 piece. What's on the way? The higher deductible plans. You all know that more of the onus is put on patients nowadays. So when we look at the Affordable Care Act, regardless of what your take on it is, more patients are having to pay more out of pocket. And I will tell you from experience what I think is going to happen, and I think you can attest to some of this. Patients are going to avoid care unless they're getting some objective financial relief to help pay for the deductibles. And what you're going to do is you're going to get sicker folks coming in the door because they're going to wait until they're auguring in, which is going to mean more cost. But patients, their care is more on them now, and they're going to be selective. They're going to be better consumers where they can be, and they're going to try to be more informed. They may value shop on this. They may say, oh, you're going to charge me $150, back to actually charge me $100. I'm going there. That may be what's coming down the road for us. So cost shift, more people are covered? Yeah, probably. But the reality is more of them are having to pay out of pocket, and that's expensive. More aggressive and respectfully and tactfully so, but you need to be more respective on collecting the front-end piece that the patient owes, whether it's via a payment plan, and again, we talked about this a little earlier. I'd like to get to the case study really quick. Here's a case study that popped up. Hundreds of physicians and extenders in this model. And I believe that you're going to get a copy of this case study after this. It will be emailed to you, I believe. Basically, how this happened, and it was respectfully, it just got out of hand. I'm going to call it a comedy errors, and I don't mean to insult anybody, but it was just this huge thing that got way out of hand. For you hospital people, what happened is misstatement of the contractual allowances for about 2 years. For you private practice folks, what that means is the hospital, when they charge, they'll charge $100. That's revenue, and then they'll state that as what's collectible. Well, what happened is the contractual adjustments were being stated year over year. Let's just call it $50. So the net income was supposed to be $50. What ended up happening is contractual adjustment really should have been about $80 because the rev cycle was so screwy. So the net income was way overstated, as you can see. What ended up happening is I think that the CFO probably thought, well, maybe I could fudge it this month, and next month, it got easy to do. And then it got easier, and no one asked questions about it. Ultimately, the CFO of that system was asked to maybe see if he could find another job. And that's sad. I mean, it's horribly sad, but I think what happened is he or she got in over their head, and then there was no way out, and it just snowballed. What happened, too, is providers were not involved. They went to the system. They wanted employment. They loved the system because the system basically took them and employed them without adjusting the practice, without looking at staffing. Because part of the deal was, hey, I need all these people. I love them. They love me, etc. Oh, well, you're a cardiologist? We need cardiology. I'm going to take you on board. And so they take them on board, and docs weren't involved because these guys had no dog in the fight. They didn't have to pay their own bills. They got a P&L occasionally, but they didn't have to manage overhead, manage staffing ratios, and manage the staff costs because they were getting paid regardless. They were on productivity, RVU, with a little bit of base thrown in there. The CBO was fractured because the piece became, hey, we're just going to manage your revenue cycle as a quote-unquote CBO. So what happened is they had a CBO for the employed practices that were already on board. For the other practices that they added, they just took, their revenue cycle and just called it PBO and started managing it. So the rev cycle, to put it mildly, was colossally broken. Providers weren't credentialed. There were providers there that weren't credentialed for a year. And so when you think about your cash flow, you've got to see that as an issue, I think, unless you're into a large chunk of community care. So in any event, patients weren't turned over to collections, no process for that, no follow-up to outstanding balances, no feedback loop on corrective action. So charges would go out. The CBO would try to manage them, never tell the front desk and the practices what was going on. So decreased revenues and revenues that didn't match the financial statements. They missed the bond covenants, which is, for those of you in the CFO realm, if any of you are on this call, obviously not a good thing. This then, it comes around. It created very tight cash flow. They came to find out the dollars in the bank weren't there to pay everyday bills. And then the rumors start, and then staff gets nervous about their pay. The days in AR became bloated. They did have a situation where someone went through and wrote some stuff off, and that artificially lowered the days in AR. Just this thing where people get scared and they react, and bad things happen when you react. Then providers heard about it and started to lose faith and confidence in the system. So you can see how it's a snowball effect, and it just ends badly. But things were just mashed onto the system without structure and design and flow. So again, you can see the structure has to be in there to manage this overused slide that I've used today. Every component in this system, from start to finish, had some sort of fracture in it. So in the case study, limited collections up front for the patient obligation time service. Charts weren't completed timely, sometimes not at all. Claims were submitted by the remote CBO, fractured if any follow-up. Practices were not accountable for mistakes. So nothing on anyone's eval. It was just the CBO tried to handle it and manage it. They never responded back, or forgive me, they very seldom, if ever, responded back to people. And no one was held accountable for remedying the mistakes that took place. No idea what the reimbursement should have been. To add insult to injury, they added provider-based reimbursement onto the thing, which for those of you who do PBB, that's an ornery critter, and you got to manage that, and it was not managed. Ad hoc account management, people tried to manage it in a processed way, a systematic way, but it just wasn't formalized. So I said the providers lost faith and confidence in tight cash flow, payroll struggle. The significance of credentialing cannot be overstated. It's got to happen. And I know there are instances where you got to add this service line. and you're going to put this guy on, and maybe he's just going to bill Medicare, so you can go back after the Medicare dollars later. But this is endemic in our business, folks, that credentialing doesn't talk or communicate with the hospital, or if you're in the private practice, you know, Dr. X just hired a guy and didn't tell you until tomorrow, or excuse me, didn't tell you until today that he's starting next week. Big problem. And so here's a little bit of how the CBO structure went. Basically, you had the CBO on an EMR. We'll call it System 1. They had two systems up there, System 1 and System 2. They added a practice who had System 2, but a different version. So you're managing all that. Then they added another practice who had another system. So you can see how this could spin out of control. It was just insult to injury. And understand, I'm not trying to make light of this, because people's lives get impacted by this, and it's scary stuff. And it's just yucky. It's just yucky. So here's what happened. The system required a design, development, and implementation of standardized P&P, policies and procedures. There's a plan to consolidate the CBO and its employees in one location, establish reporting structures and consistent lines of communication, place an interim. So what happened too is, you might imagine, the CBO director decided that resignation might be the best. And so an interim seasoned executive who knew CBO business was placed in there to help babysit this thing back to good health. Consolidation of disparate processes throughout the organization. There came a time where people had to be firm and say, hey, we've got to do things this way. I understand there needs to be a little bit of latitude, whether it's a specialty thing or a surge thing or whatever, but by and large, we need some standardization. And then oversight and realignment, streamlining of staff, instituted better defined positions and responsibilities, and improved feedback to the practices so that errors created at the practice level were now fixed at the level. The practices had to feel some of the pain for the mistakes they were making. So as you can see, all of those things that I spoke to in the beginning, or I hope you can see that, is that it's coming back to roost in this. And these are the structural pieces that now put in place to remedy the system. So we improved front office collections at check-in. They had a budget that was 20% over whatever budget we could figure they were on in the previous year. They exceeded that by 40, I think it was 41%. I'll look on the, I think on the next slide. And they are doing 7 figures of collections on the front end. And there's not a huge system, but you know, anywhere over $1 million to 900 or 9.999 million is a pretty good get on the front end. The long-term strategy obviously would include finding a single point IT platform, automation of the processes where applicable for efficiencies, payment posting, you know, structure and process, centralized business office rebuild, standardization of staff expectations. Policy and procedures are essential, as are the policy and procedure manual and the understanding of staff what their obligations are on the employee manual piece of things. The goals and targets: measure, monitor, communicate. Monthly monitoring and reporting, and physician engagement. The physicians knew nothing about this until word started to leach out into the community, and it did get in the community, and then it got into the local paper. So in any event, here's kind of how things went. Haphazard cash collections, they increased the budget 20%, excuse me, so they were 22% over the 20% budget for the year over year. Days in AR within, I think, 9 months went from 65 to 47.9. Charges, here again, I threw this out as a measure. It's not the end-all, be-all, but charges went up 6%. And again, one of the things you can bounce that off of is physician scheduling. Physicians added more patients. So there we get efficiencies and patients coming in the door. Collections were up 23%, and their net AR, or excuse me, their AR over 120 was down 4%. So all in all, progress. The goal here: review the process, start to finish, assign a touchstone to lead and manage the thing, document processes, input from staff, educate staff. Make sure you understand that the thing is a system that's always moving and changing. You can't push play and watch it manage itself. Accurate data capture all the way through the process. Coding by the providers and the role they play is essential. So I'm sorry that I raced it, and I'm sorry I went over. If anyone wants to fire away with some questions, folks can stay on if they'd like to do that. Or, you know, honestly, you can call me, you can email me, and we can continue the discussion a little bit later, or even carve out some time. I'm willing to just chat. Obviously, I can't spend 8 hours on the phone all day long, but I'm willing to chat and, exchange some thoughts and ideas and help you as best I can because, honestly, I feel like got to give some back. I've been in this business a long time. I know that it's a big, big kernel to push uphill, and we're all struggling, so we're all kind of in this together. Someone had asked the most reliable sourcing for benchmarking reference points. The MGMA puts out a pretty good list. If you're in the AMGA, I'm sure they do too. If you're running surgery centers, you can get some other specialty-specific surge center data out there. I think Becker's does a pretty good job of aggregating some of those benchmarks. And I think the thing to remember too is that the benchmark should be a starting point for where you are. Not everything fits everything you do. Understand the sample size of the benchmark material. If you have 5 providers that report it in, obviously that data has no value. Coker has some proprietary benchmark data that we've aggregated over our 25 to 30 years in the business. So what you do is you look at these different points and build out what works for you. And I would show the physicians, if you're pulling from different sources, MGMA, MGA, Becker's, or Coker Group, or whatever the case may be, and show them what those look like to show where they are relative to those standards. But you also need to figure out what works for you. But the flip side of that is don't make it so malleable where, hey, Dr. X thinks 90% of our money in 120 days works for us. That just isn't factually, well, you'll go out of business is what happens. So in any event, the message there is there's good data out there. Whoever this is, if you would like to just shoot me an email, I can do some legwork for you and get you some stuff or find out more definitively what specialty you're in, or if you're in an employed service model, what that data looks like. I also, for those of you on the phone, had a question from somebody about the like the challenges that are coming down the road, and I did hit on this as we went along. Really managing the patient dollars. Back in the day when patient pay was much less than it is now, it was a little easier to manage. Your doctor to just say, I love Mrs. Smith. She's been a CHF patient, congestive heart failure patient with my practice for 10 years, and I'm just going to write off the rest of her balance. Well, nowadays, that becomes a little more onerous. I mean, you just can't, you need to collect the dollars. It's just getting harder and harder. And I will tell you, your cost to run your business, whether you're in the hospital side or the private side, again, in the private practice side, every dollar that's spent doesn't drop through to the shareholders. And so, your insurance costs are increasing every year. Your med mal is probably going up incrementally every year. Your employee costs are going to go up. If you've got long-term employees, they've got, compensation creep built into that. So the cost side is not going to go down. You've got to manage overhead, manage your supply side on some of that stuff, manage staffing and get them in and out efficiently, optimize their workload when they're in so that they're doing everything they need to do. I'll just throw this out tangentially, and forgive me, but this, again, speaks to how this is all a big process. You can't just say, look at my revenue cycle. For instance, part of the revenue cycle, Dr. X sees 5 patients a day. He's on a guaranteed comp plan with the hospital. Well, you know what? 5 patients a day doesn't pay the bills. And I will tell you, we've had a client that uses RNs to room patients. Now, the doctors may love that, but that's well under the scope of an RN's practice ability, and you could certainly utilize them running a specialty clinic or use them in another way. MAs can do all that workup and can help you more efficiently and be the right hand for the physician. So in any event, again, that's part of the struggle for us as we go forward. It's going to be, how do we manage the cost side of things, which will entail optimizing our staff, our resources, our IT structure and bandwidth, and making good use of our data. And then on the other side is making sure that we pull in all those dollars that are due us. And the thing that does scare me is that patient pay piece. It's just bigger. And I do think patients will avoid care because some of them aren't going to want to pay. So we are over, and forgive me for that. I got a little long-winded in the beginning. I honestly thought I'd finish in 40 minutes. So I appreciate your time. I do beg your forgiveness. I know you're all busy, and I really am grateful that that you carved out some time today. I hope you found this useful. Again, I do think that, broadly speaking, the rev cycle management piece applies to everybody. It just depends on your situation, how you scale it, and how you manage it to fit where you are. So please, if you would, reach out to me. You know, honestly, free. Just give me a call, shoot me an email, let's chat a little bit. I'd love to catch up with you. I'd love to stay connected with folks in the business. I'm really passionate about what we do, and I really like to help make a difference. So without further ado, I think I will turn it back to Savannah and say thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jeff, for that presentation. Like you said, if you have additional questions, feel free to reach out to him directly. Again, the slides in this presentation will be emailed to you shortly. And we thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful day.